Welcome. Oh, okay, here we go. Hi, everyone, welcome. And make sure you grab some pizza if you want it, get settled. Welcome. My name is Erica Watson. I use she, her, and hers, and I'm a second year student here at the School of Social Work. I want to welcome I never asked you how to say your last name. Oh no. Nicolazzo. Pronoun Z here to campus. Z is an assistant professor and faculty associate at Northern Illinois University. Her research focuses on mapping gender across college contexts with a particular emphasis on affirmative and resilience-based research alongside trans students. Z recently published a book titled Trans in College, Transgender Students Strategies for Navigating Campus Life and the Institutional Politics of Inclusion. So join me in welcoming Z.
Oh, wow, okay, that's what it's like to have a mic. It's really nice to be here. This is my first trip to the University of Michigan, and I know I'm probably not meant to say this, but my advisor is from that other school down south. So hey, at least there's one person that's excited about that. So I just haven't really told Elisa that I'm here. So we'll just keep it a secret between all of us. But no, it's nice to see some familiar faces. Nice to see a beautiful campus even on dreary days. And it's nice to be in the School of Social Work. I have a very dear friend and colleague who used to work here, and so it's nice to kind of see where he hung out for a number of years. So thanks for being here. And if nothing else, hopefully the pizza is good, right? So if I don't say anything interesting, you got some free food. So I figured what I would do today is talk a little bit about who I am, about my process and coming to the research that I did as a little bit of a teaser for tonight's talk. I'm doing a talk on campus about the book itself and kind of working through some particularities of the book. So yeah, and if there are questions, we'll leave some time towards the end for that as well. So a little bit about myself, a little bit about kind of my story. So currently, as was mentioned, I'm an assistant professor. I'm in my third year as an assistant professor in what's we call it our adult and higher ed program, right? It's like a student affairs, higher ed administration kind of program for master's and doctoral students at Northern Illinois University. I'm also a faculty associate in the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, longest name in the title, or right, longest name in the book, on campus. But before that, I worked on college campuses. I was a student affairs practitioner. So doing work not in academic affairs, but in student affairs, being alongside students and helping them think about their own growth and development as people in kind of this container that we call colleges and universities. I worked in student housing for a number of years. I worked as a sexual violence prevention educator on a very large campus in the Southwest for a year. And then I transitioned to working in Greek life with fraternities and sororities. And then I came out as trans. So if you don't know anything about Greek affairs, right, fraternities and sororities, it's heavily gendered, right? Just an FYI, heavily gendered space, heavily kind of normatively gendered space, right? And I was doing this work at the University of Arizona. And if folks, is anyone from the Southwest or familiar with Southwest politics? Yeah, a little bit. Okay, so some people in the room probably remember that in the years from, right, I was there from 2007 to 2011, right? And so bills like SB 1070, right, came into effect. Our then governor, Jan Brewer, right, not a very great person. HB 2281 happened, right, the ban on ethnic studies, La Raza studies, the Tucson Unified School District was happening right down the road from the University of Arizona, right? Proposition 107 effectively ending affirmative action in the state happened as well. Shortly after I left, Arizona was proposing bathroom legislation that we've seen in various other states, North Carolina, Texas, right? to kind of try and determine and police who can use which restrooms. And really what was happening was the policing of transgender women by and large, right? This is about trans misogyny, about this idea that trans women aren't women, but they're men in dresses, right? So at the time that I came out, I was petrified, right? Petrified not only for myself, but also feeling intensely isolated and not really knowing to whom I could turn or how I could even kind of share this, right, in my work setting. In fact, I felt like I couldn't share this in my work setting, right? Like I couldn't go to my director of Greek life and be like, hey, I'm trans, and I really want to think about how that shows up for me, right? Not only was there a barrier in terms of understanding what transness meant in the office, but when you have such rigid gender norms and kind of deeply embedded gender norms, right? Like I just didn't even know where to start. Right? And so I remember having this conversation with one of my friends, Chase, and I was sitting outside at a coffee shop, and I whispered into the phone, I think I'm trans and I have no idea what to do about that, right? He was like, okay, maybe you should do some reading, right? So I'm someone that kind of comes to know myself and comes to know topics through books, right? I always have some kind of book with me. So I did some reading. And so what I would do is I would like go to my job, right, during the day. I would play boy during the day, and then I would go home and I would be with my community through books in the evening, right? Sit out on my patio because Arizona is super hot, even at night, right? In the 90-degree weather at 8 o'clock at night. Reading books like trans historian Susan Stryker's book, Transgender History, or Julia Serrano's first book, which I actually think is her best, Whipping Girl, right? And thinking about the realities of trans misogyny for trans women. I would read Dean Spade's work, right? A critical legal scholar who's trans and started the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. This is how I built my community, right? Is through pages and texts, right? And I always knew, right? I knew when I started my career in student affairs that I wanted to go back and I wanted to get my PhD at some point, right? I tend to be a student who really thrives in the classroom. I really like learning. And so I knew that I wanted to do this. I think what I realized more and more, particularly kind of in that last year to year and a half, was that my life in Arizona and my life as a practitioner at that particular moment felt highly unsustainable. Right? And so I knew that I needed to kind of plan an exit. I knew that I needed to leave. There was nothing keeping me in Arizona. I had and still have a wonderful dog. And she, while I care about her, she doesn't really have a say in where we go, right? Like she just jumps in the car and we go over wherever we need to go. And so I could go anywhere in the country. And was fortunate enough to be accepted and ended up deciding to go to Miami University, the one in Ohio, not the one in Florida, right? Crappier weather, better program. You know, even though I was moving to an area of the country where John Boehner would be my representative, it was actually a really liberatory move for me. And I know that sounds really strange, but like, think about it, right? Like as a person who was coming into my trans identity, who wanted to explore who I was, who felt very unsafe in Arizona at the time, right? Even as a white trans person, I felt incredibly unsafe in that environment. Moving to Southwest Ohio provided me a chance to have a do-over, right? And the more I thought about, right, moving to Oxford, Ohio, having this little bit of a do-over, getting to start again, I started to think about my dissertation topic and started to think about, what about students who don't get a chance to have a do-over? What about students who might be on a college campus and might not be able to, right, for finances or other reasons, be able to just move across the country and start again, right? But who are still trans, right? And I wasn't trans when I was in college, right? That wasn't my experience. And so I wanted to kind of learn about this population and think about what happens when maybe we're location bound, right? And we need to make do with the environment that we have, right? So that's kind of where this project started, is kind of thinking about particular places and how we navigate these particular places, right? Given what we know about the social climate, right? And what we know about the social climate is this, right? My work is rooted in critical paradigms and critical epistemologies, which basically means that I take as a given the fact that systemic oppression exists, right? It's in the very air that we breathe. If we think about critical race theory, right, we can think about kind of this genealogy of research and really legal writing that talks about the fact that racism is a facet of everyday life, right? One need not even point out a particular racist incident for racism to pervade across environments, right? That it shapes the way that we think, it shapes the way that we work through our days, right? Similarly, the same exists for transgender oppression, right? Trans oppression, that this actually just is in the ether, right? And so if we take this as being a given socially, then we also know that it happens on college campuses, right? Because life doesn't stop at the gates, right, of college campuses. That what happens on college campuses leaks off college campuses, and what happens off campus comes onto campus as well, right? And so I just kind of took as a given, right, that trans oppression exists on college spaces, and was really curious about how it is that trans students make sense of their environment and navigate their environment, right? We knew at the time, right, anecdotally, that trans people were successful in navigating through college, right, in whatever various ways they think about success, be that graduation and persistence, which is a fairly normative way of thinking about success, or in terms of how we might personally identify our own success, right? And I knew that people were successful based on the fact that, like, just when I looked in the mirror and I had an N of 1, I was pursuing a terminal degree, right? So, like, I was doing it, right? Clearly, there were other people who were doing this as well, right? And I wanted to kind of talk with them about, like, how is it that you navigate this space that, like, is deeply problematic, right? Like, how is it that you are able to live your life and be successful on your own terms, right? That's what I was kind of thinking about, like, how do you do this on your own terms? I was also really thinking about work that didn't take deficit approaches, right, to thinking about trans students. You folks being in a school of social work know all about, right, deficit versus affirmative-based studies and how we need to resist deficit-based notions of research, right? That we can't continue to do this work that says, well, trans students aren't doing as well academically, they're not doing as well in terms of leadership development, they're not doing as well in terms of taking study abroad opportunities than their cisgender or non-trans peers. Therefore, gosh, they're really losing out, right? They just need to catch up. They need to do better. They need to take more opportunities to do study abroad. They need to become more active leaders, right? That kind of research needs to stop, right? And so I wanted to think about what are affirmative ways that I can be with and alongside transgender students through the research process rather than doing a study on or about trans students, right? How is it that I can study community while building community, right? It's a rather meta process. And so what I ended up doing was doing a collaborative ethnographic project, an 18-month collaborative ethnographic project. And what I'll do is I'll talk about the book itself and the research itself tonight, but I wanted to chat maybe a little bit about some ways that I thought about entering and leaving the field as a researcher, right? So when you think about how many people are familiar with ethnography? Just so I can, okay, so a couple of people. I'll give like a little bit of a kind of primer. And please know, if you don't, that you have some phenomenal ethnographic researchers on this campus, right? Dr. Gail Rubin happens to teach here, who's beyond brilliant in terms of the queer theoretical work that she's been doing for years. So ethnographic research, right, is they're cultural studies, right? So thinking about cultural discourses and cultures and environments. And some researchers, Norm Denson, for example, talks about ethnography as a form of deep hanging out, right? Which I actually think is a really good kind of definition for what ethnography is. You're spending time with and immersing yourself in a particular community, a particular culture, right? So for me, that setting was City University, which was, it's a pseudonym, right? In an area, a urban area in the Midwest, which I call Stockdale. City University is a little bit smaller maybe than the University of Michigan, but still a large institution, urban setting. And in Stockdale, there was also a, let's say, an ongoing history of anti-Black racism that was embedded through the city, right, in terms of history as well as politics and legislation, as well as anti-LGBTQ legislation, right? So this is kind of the history and the situation that City University kind of sprouts from. And so I'm doing this study, right, really thinking about how I want to be with students for what ended up to be 18 months, right, a year and a half. So my study spanned 2 academic years. And as I was going through the research process, I started to encounter these situations that I didn't necessarily kind of think would happen, right? Ethnographers, by and large, kind of the older normative notion of ethnography is that you go out into the field, you collect data, and then you leave the field and write stuff up, right? That's kind of like this older notion of ethnography. What I found was that I wasn't really sure where the field started and where it ended. And I began having and continue to have some real concerns, some real ethical concerns about what it means to leave the field, particularly alongside marginalized populations, right? And so I'm going to pull just a little bit from some writing that I've been doing about this to kind of talk through some of these particularities. So the first thing that I began thinking about was how me showing up as a non-binary kind of feminine of center person impacted the participants that saw themselves in the call, right? Call for participation. So how is it that me being trans, the way that I am trans, mediated who decided to join my study, right? And what I realized was that, so I had this like quick little demographic survey that I had people fill out and give me their contact information. It's a little like Google form. And then I would phone them, right? And we would set up a time to kind of chat through and be like, hey, here's the study, right? Here's what we can do, blah, blah, blah. And I started seeing that some people were filling out the beginning information, but then not leaving any kind of contact info, right? And I was like, this is really interesting. So clearly they know themselves to be trans, but I'm wondering what's stopping them or what's mediating that process where they're not giving their contact information, they're not kind of finalizing this piece of being a participant, right? I then went to a program towards the end of my first semester of data collection and met a new trans person on campus. And I went up to her and I said, hey, I'm doing this research. I'm really wondering if you might be interested in participating. Here's a little bit about myself, right? And she said, I've been transitioning for years, right? And I don't actually think of myself as trans anymore, right? Which is a real narrative for folks, right? And in particular, people who biomedically transition. That sometimes when people biomedically transition and they pass, right, for all the kind of weight that that word has with it, they might not even identify as trans anymore, right? And so she said, I'm not really interested in participating, right? There was another student who I talked with who said, I'd be really interested in participating, but I'm stealth. And so, right, stealth meaning that I'm not out as trans, right? And that I pass as the gender that I would like to be seen as. And so I started thinking about how my kind of gender expression might maybe out this particular student in ways that he wasn't comfortable being outed, right? What does it mean to have a maybe visibly genderqueer trans person being alongside a student who's stealth that then needs to kind of figure out how to talk with people about like why they're hanging out, right? And I know I look young, but I'm also clearly older than a college student, right? So like, so that might be, right, like a little bit of a tell. And so the student's like, I don't really know. So I started thinking a lot about like, how is it that I show up as a researcher? And how is it that my gender shows up as someone who does gender-based research? And how does that mediate who are participants in my study? Who are participants in our studies, right? Based on who the participants are, how does that shift the knowledge that's then created? How does that then shift the policy implications and the practice-based implications from the knowledge base that's created? Right? And how does that then shift college campuses in certain ways based on who picks up those implications and those data, right? So there's something about us as researchers that may invite or disinvite participants, whether we want to or not, right? The other thing that I kept on thinking about, remember I said I wasn't a trans college student, and so, you know, I spent a lot of time on this campus not with students as well, right? Ethnographic research is really interested in kind of the environment, right? I did then what I do often when I come to speak on college campuses. I spend a lot of time walking around, right? And in some senses, and I was just doing this yesterday on this campus, I was walking around and I feel like I'm kind of like walking with these ghosts of trans people as I walk across campuses, right? So like I'm having certain thoughts and experiences and feelings and wondering like, what is it that these students might also be feeling about this environment, right? So City University was built, literally built around a football stadium that was carved into the campus, right? It was carved into the ground, right? You go into the stadium and the campus was built around that stadium. When I went on a campus tour, right? If you ever do ethnography, go on a tour of whatever campus or environment you're doing research at. They walked us through the main administrative building for the athletics department and pointed out the trophies and talked about where the athletic director's office was and how the athletic director likes to play kind of pump up like rock and roll music throughout the building, and you can hear it, and we're all one big athletic family. Every Saturday is when everyone goes to the football games. And like, you know, if there's one kind of like hyper gendered space that's not fraternities and sororities on campus, it's probably athletics, right? You all know that, right? Like I think that you have a decent football team, right? Like, you know what this is like. And so I kept on having these, and I was a sports player when I was a kid, but I kept on thinking about like the discourse around gender and athletics, and what does this mean for a potential student who's trans and going through this, right, tour? What does it mean when certain rituals are imbued with binary notions of gender? And so I kept on kind of thinking about like, who are these participants? How might they be experiencing this environment, right? I then had this really interesting situation where about 3 or 4 weeks into my data collection, one of my participants sent me a friend request on Facebook. And I was like, oh shit. I hadn't thought about that one, right? So I like ran to my advisor's office, right? What do I do, right? And you know, I think about like the more I thought about it, I was like, okay, so, and then it happened again and again and again, right? And these participants are desiring connection, right? This is what happens with marginalized people on kind of dominant majoritarian campuses, is like they don't see a lot of people like them, right? And so they're hungry and craving connection. And you know, I saw that not only just in terms of Facebook friend requests, but like one of my participants mentioned a couple of times, you know, she says, yeah, I mean, if you want to get together and hang out off campus, I'm happy to do that. Right? And I was like, okay, yeah, sure, that's fine, right? And so one day we're walking after this event. We're going like towards, right, like she's going towards her car, I'm going towards my car, and she says to me, hey, do you want to come over? You want to smoke some pot? And so like, and so here's the moment. I was like, shit. By the way, for folks that might not know, my dissertation advisor is a Harvard-trained lawyer, right? So I was like, oh wow, here's a different kind of framing. And so I thought about this fact that, like, regardless of how I think about or feel about, right, smoking pot, that BC was not, it wasn't about like, hey, let's do some drugs together. It was about like, hey, how do we build a connection and how can we be people together? How can we build community, right? So in that moment, right, how is it that I could, how could I kind of articulate, BC, I see you as a person, I care about you as a person, and yet, right, I can't really do this right now, right? I had a really good excuse. I said, well, you know, I'm starting to train more with my cycling. I'm a cyclist, and so I said I'm starting to train more and can't really smoke. It'll mess up my training. Right? That was just a really good excuse and came off really well. But I didn't want to like shame BC and be like, gosh, no, that's terrible. Why would you? Right? Because like all BC really wanted was a connection. BC was just looking for other trans friends. Right? So what happens when we're in an age of virtual media and digital platforms, when we're working alongside marginalized populations who are looking for a connection beyond just researcher and participant, right? It feels, and I'll share this again tonight with folks, but it feels very strange to talk about these people as participants. I see them as my friends. I see them as my colleagues, as my peers, as my mentors in many different ways that very similar to the way that they see me as mentors. And you know, this kind of leads me to this like piece about leaving. Like, how is it that I meant to quote unquote leave the field and leave these participants? There was a real sense of loss, both for me as well as for my participants around this piece of leaving. I remember I was living at the time with a very dear friend who was a year ahead of me in the dissertation process. And as sometimes happens when you write dissertations, right? Like Michael would go up to his office upstairs and write during the day. I would go to my office downstairs and write during the day. And then we'd get together and we would not talk about dissertations, right? Because like the first rule of writing a dissertation is not to talk about how it's going. And Michael asked me one night and he said, so when are you finishing up data collection? Right? Very innocuous question. And I started weeping on the couch because I was like, oh, like when you finish something, right? Like when I finish a book, I put it on the shelf and it's away, right? Like it's tucked away, it has its nice little spot. And I don't want to put these kids away yet. I'm not ready for that. And the students were telling me that they weren't ready for it either, right? When I said, hey, I'm going to start wrapping up, right? Like there's this palpable sense of loss. When students say, I feel more comfortable expressing and exploring my gender because I know that you exist, right? Like, how do you stop that? How do you say, here's the line and we're done with this? How do you do ethnographic research in this normative way of doing ethnographic research? And if you keep your relationship with participants, if you keep these connections going, then what might that mean when you're sharing research? Because, you know, it needs to be rigorous, right, and trustworthy. Like, so how do you talk about ethnography that spans boundaries and that doesn't really think about leaving participants, right? And this is the ethical kind of component to my research, is that like I actually think it's highly unethical for us to do ethnographic research and really any type of research with marginalized people where we kind of sever connection with them and we say, this is it, right? Like we're done, that project is over and I'm moving on, right? That this is, it can be a very dangerous and, dare I say, quite violent practice, right? To kind of leave these people behind. So, you know, I didn't, right? These are people who, when I first got my advanced copies of the book, that I sent those copies to the participants, right? These are some of the first people that when I went back to the Southwest earlier this year, the Southwest Ohio earlier this year, these are some of the first people who I said, hey, I'm gonna be in town, can we get together, right? These are some of the first people who, when we have successes and when we find out that people are reading the book in all sorts of places, right? Like England and Australia, right? Like I'm connecting with these people and saying, hey, our work is being shared, right? People are hearing your stories, right? That we keep in touch over digital platforms like Instagram, like Twitter, these kinds of spaces, right? To help prolong some of these relationships. And I think it's a little bit of a different take on doing research, but I also think that it's a a more ethical, less violent, and more collaborative kind of way of thinking about the research that we do, particularly amongst populations who are clamoring to have people who care about them, who see them as fully human, right? Like, we know that, you know, we might wake up to various different tweets from certain folks who are working on a dehumanizing project, right? This is not just about bathrooms. It's not just about, right, being involved in the military. It's about eradicating certain populations from public view, as Laverne Cox has said, and probably will say when she's here on campus very soon, right? So this is kind of what's at stake, and I don't mean to kind of like big up my work and say like my work is like, you know, the tipping point, right? But like, I do think that even in these micro spaces, the research that we do, the work that we do alongside of populations, that we're really trying to find ways to see each other as human and be with and alongside each other. So in true faculty fashion, I've spoken maybe a bit longer than I had thought, but there's a couple laughs, that's good. But I think we have about 20 minutes, and so I just want to open it up and see if there are questions, if there are thoughts, people want to kind of chat a little bit. I also have some other pieces that I can talk through if you're interested, but I'll be quiet for a moment. Yeah.
So, as a fellow junior faculty member, I am all 100% on board with all of this. How do we colonize research and how do we do all of these things and still get tenure?
Yeah.
So I would just really love to hear your thoughts about how you are navigating institutional systems that might not understand your research or understand the direction that you're going, and how you kind of push through and around and over, and where you find complexes to make that happen.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, and I'll repeat just so to make sure that it's picked up on the mic. Question is about how to do this type of research and still make forward progress towards tenure, right, as early career folks. Yeah, it's a really good question. And I also want to be really clear that my particular institutional setting is a little different from the University of Michigan, or what I perceive is happening at the University of Michigan. I'm not at a publisher parish institution. I think Northern Illinois probably bigs themselves up a little bit more than they truly exist in terms of research. They say that they're research intensive. They're happy if you do writing, right? And so I have a very different reality, I think, than the University of Michigan. That being said, I will say that when I was in the second and third year of my doctoral program, I had some very serious conversations with some of my committee members, because I wanted to be a faculty member, but our program was not known for having faculty members come out of it. In fact, the doctoral program that I went to was incredibly young. I was only the second kind of official cohort to go through this doctoral program. The higher ed program at Miami is actually quite known for the master's program, which Gordon went to the master's program. And so Peter, one of my faculty members, said, you're going to have to hustle a lot more in order to be seen, right? And I took that to heart, right? I worked myself until I was sick at many points in time, right? Like towards physical exhaustion, trying to write for publication. And at this point in time, my being trans was so close, right? My coming out was so close that like a rejection of my work felt like a rejection of me, right? And this is what happens sometimes, right, when we have marginalized identities, and we do work with and alongside our populations. So all that to say, the strategies that I have used have been to work alongside other scholars. I find that to be particularly important. You can share authorship, right? So you can rotate through authorship. I'll be first author on this piece, you'll be first author on the next piece, kind of deal. I also have learned really through trial and error to tap into the mentoring relationships that you have, even if they are not on this particular campus, right? It is very strange that my book was published a year after I finished my dissertation. That's fast, right? The only reason that happened was because I made a passing comment to one of my very best friends, who is a full faculty member and has published with this particular publishing house that I published through, Stylus. I said, yeah, you know, I think that I might ask one of my faculty members to maybe do an introduction between me and the editor-in-chief of this publishing company, maybe at some point towards the end of my first year on the tenure track. And Z said, no, I've published with John before. I will just introduce you right now. I said, well, I haven't even, like the ink hasn't even dried on my dissertation yet. And so Z introduced me, right, via email, said some very nice things that I still to this day believe are untrue, but Z continues to say that they weren't. And the editor-in-chief saw an opportunity. I sent the dissertation to him. He read it and he said, let's make this a book, right? And so I think as uncomfortable as it might be, maybe just making asks of our mentors and seeing where those chips fall could be really important, right? Like, I didn't want to put on my friend, right? I didn't want to have to rely on other people because, you know, we're classically trained not to rely on anyone, right? Especially in the academy, right? And the other thing that I just want to be really clear about too is that my life looks very different than some other people's lives, right? Like I'm single, my family is not in the Midwest, and so I'm protected a little bit. Like if there are things that happen with my family, right? I don't necessarily have to like drop everything and go kind of deal. So I've just been able to, I've had the privilege to do a ton of writing, right? And then also I think I'm benefiting from the fact that, well, when I started, no one was really writing about trans college students, right? So I'm almost benefiting from the marginalization and oppression that currently exists, right, in some really weird kind of way. So yeah, but yeah, I think using your mentors effectively. I think writing alongside people, and also like how can you find venues and publication outlets so that you can tell a story rather than trying to fit your work into top tier publications, right? Like there are certain publication venues I will not submit to that are top tier because I just have no interest and they clearly have no interest in my work too, right? So like how then can we craft our message around like this is why I'm submitting to certain journals, which might be really important at a place like Michigan. Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
I want to make a comment. My name is Laura Sanders and I teach the LGBTQ course here, the one course that exists
Oh,
the
that's
last
sad.
15 years.
Okay. Well, I'm glad there's at least one.
So yeah, there is. And I just wanted to also, I'm an interpersonal practice person and a community organizer. I have a lot of traumatized clients because I work with sexually abused children, work with the trans and LGBTQ community. And also, I've done a lot of organizing in the immigrant community, responding to increased immigration enforcement around here, because we're within 100 miles of the border, and it's been nasty for the last 9 years. So I just wanted to say that I relate so much to what you're saying in every across concentrations in social work, that those boundary issues that need to be fluidly navigated. I find it in my interpersonal work with clients where the door is always open. Right? I've seen clients come back and back and back, and I see some of my clients' children now, right? The door is always open. In my community organizing work, people have been dropped off on our driveway, right? I have my robe on. You know, how do you navigate this? And that it's different.
Yeah.
It's very different. My spouse is actually Mexican, and so of course, when you're identifying with the community, you're in a different situation, as you put it. But I just really wanted to make that comment that I think that this issue of fluidity around boundaries and the kind of tactful and thoughtful, conscious navigation of that exists across the concentrations in social work, from interpersonal practice to community organizing to research to policy.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, this word, I'm not sure how this word kind of plays out in social work settings. It's certainly been played way too much in student affairs and higher education, but this then makes me think about the self-care that we need to do, right, and how we are good to ourselves. If our doors are always open to certain communities, if we're always with and alongside the people that we do work with, then how are we getting the rejuvenation and the rest that we need, right? And I really go back to Audre Lorde's work and thinking about this as not self-indulgence, right? It's about self-preservation and an act of political warfare, right? To take care of ourselves. And I think that this is even all the more prescient right now, right? I wish it weren't, but it certainly is, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question. So the question is about, did I use participatory action research kind of methods or community-based methods like that? No, I didn't. I was very clear that I wasn't doing a participatory action research project. I think that that was probably a little beyond my capabilities as a new researcher, right? To do a PAR project. I would like to do one, right? And I'm actually trying to envision what that could like with and alongside some of my fellow trans scholars right now. What I did do, and this is kind of common ethnographic practice, but people, when you pick a site, right, for your research, you're encouraged to spend time at that site, make connections at that site. And so that's what I did. The semester before I started my research, I spent some time at City University, met some people, talked with some students, and actually talked with potential participants and said, here's the study that I'm planning on doing. Do you have questions? Do you have thoughts? Do you have concerns? At least in higher ed settings, LGBTQ, I'll just say people, right, with diverse genders and sexualities, they tend to be over-researched, right? So like, Mark, I'm sure you probably get multiple emails every week saying, hey, I have this research study. Can you send this link out to your students, right? And so students, I think, become highly skeptical, right, of this stuff, right? And as well as practitioners get highly skeptical of these researchers. And so I wanted to make some connections and right, just create some relationships as individuals. And what actually ended up happening is that the first day after I got my IRB approval and I went to City University, that first day that I was on campus, I left campus with about 3 participants, right, because of some of that early rapport building. Yeah. So not participatory action research, but yes, rapport building. Yeah.
So how did you end up negotiating the boundaries with the people that you were working with?
Yeah. How did I negotiate boundaries? That's a really good question. So the first thing that I did was I got a therapist, right? Very clearly, right? Very clearly, I got a therapist. Because, you know, the other thing that happens is that when we work with marginalized populations, we become the carriers of traumatic stories often, right? We become the carriers of experiences of hurt, as well as some experiences of joy and liberation. But you know, to hear some of these stories, or to even hear participants who are like, I don't have anyone that I can turn to, right? In some senses, I was glad that they had me. In other senses, I was like, oh shit, that's terrible, right? And so I got a therapist to kind of work through a lot of that stuff. I also worked alongside students to try and do some troubleshooting and try and maybe even do a little bit of capacity building in the moment, right? Like, what resources do you have? Who are you connecting with? Where do you feel the most alive, right? Like, and how can you utilize those networks, right? This is what we came to call kinship networks, right? What are your networks across campus that you can utilize to be seen and understood on your own terms? You know, these ranged from you know, one participant, Sylvia, said that she felt most comfortable in College of Art. Using her own words, she said, everyone's a little bit weird, and so it's great to go there. Another student, Adam, said that he felt most comfortable being in the Starbucks on campus because apparently the Starbucks there was hella queer. And I can tell you from an empirical perspective, it was really queer. Some people spent a lot of time some people spend a lot of time at the LGBT center, right? And so they had these, they called them queer bubbles, right? And so how could they create a network out of these bubbles, right, where they felt seen and heard and understood? And these bubbles actually moved beyond campus. Cade created a queer and trans reading club, right, book club that he asked me to participate in that was really fun in Stockdale. Megan was a gamer, and when she felt unseen on campus, she'd go back to her room and play women video game characters to be able to see herself, right? These are practices of resilience, as we talk about, right? These are ways and strategies that we can try to navigate and resist all of these kind of normative gender-based assumptions that are literally embedded into the architecture and the mythos of college campuses. So yeah, we did a little bit of capacity building in some senses. Yeah. We have about 5 more minutes, so. I mean, I clearly can fill those 5 minutes if there are no questions, but yeah.
So for students, especially MSW, want to do this type of work, either eventually in a PhD program or through their community practice, what are the steps for them and how to engage in this work?
Thank you for asking that question, right? How can MSW students kind of move forward with this type of work? The first thing I would say is this. Take some self-inventory and ask yourself, how are you investing your time, your energy, and your resources, right? I get it, student budget, so maybe not the financial resources stuff yet, right? But if you have a Netflix account, are you watching things like Tangerine, right? Which, and this shouldn't be an oddity, but like, it's a film about trans women of color that these characters are played by trans women of color, right? How can you purchase prints to have in your office, right? I was just talking with some faculty and staff on campus and talking about the work of Micah Bazant, who's a trans artist. And Micah's work is beautiful, it's wonderful, it features largely trans women of color and femmes of color. These prints are $25 to $40. They're not that much, right? So for the cost of 5 lattes, you too could have some artwork that you put up in your office that my community, like, we know who these people are. When we see CC McDonald on the wall, we know who she is, right? We know who Jamal Lewis is. We know who Marsha Payton Amine Johnson is. And so if we invest in this kind of artwork and use these artifacts and these symbols, not just merely as tokens, but as a sign that you're invested in the ongoing liberation work of us, right? Because my liberation is wrapped up in yours, right? Then that will be meaningful, right? Are you reading books about the populations that you care deeply about, right? I actually think that when we read, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, that we need to be courting difference, right? Like, I shouldn't be reading books just about white people, right? And so how can you read fiction that stretches beyond who you are, right? How can you learn about different communities? That, I think, is the first step, right? The second step then is to kind of show up in different places, right? So like queer and trans people on college campuses, right? Like, we take inventory when we're at events like this. We take inventory when we're at events like the one tonight, right? And we look around and we say, who's there, right? And if I've seen that you're at an event, right, and then we're at another event, then like maybe we can have a chat about trans stuff, right? Because you seem down, you're with it, and you listen to this weird person talk for however long, right? So that, I think, is particularly important. Where are you spending your time, right? And then, CC McDonald makes this really important point. She talked at the University of Chicago a number of years ago, and she talked about how trans women of color in particular have continued to put their bodies on the line for this broader LGBTQ movement, for this broader Black Lives Matter movement, for just broader movements towards liberation and justice, right? And so I'm not suggesting that you need to put your bodies on the line. I am inviting you to think about, what are you willing to give up in the name of liberation and justice? What discomfort can you deal with as we move forward in terms of liberatory praxis? And And how can you be in community with other people to talk about what you're willing to do, right? Because if you're in community with each other and you're answering this question, then you can then hold each other accountable to that, right? So those are maybe some strategies that I might encourage you to think about, right? Are you willing to take a lower paying job to do work alongside populations that you care about and that you believe in? Or are you going to leave those communities behind for the cushy job that separates you from your community, right? Those are real questions. And there's no one right answer, right? We all have different realities, we all have different needs, and we all have different pressures and stresses. But to think about how we can plug in, I think is particularly important, and what we're willing to give up, I think is particularly important. I think that's my time. Oh, have at it.
The reason I want to make an announcement is that there is a mini course that I'm developing right now that is like last minute on the book. LGBTQ, working, very practice oriented. It's going to be on Saturday the 2nd and Sunday the 3rd, okay, all day. So if you want to register for that, it's hot off the press. No, December. Yeah, the end of this term, which is why I'm taking this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Because you may not even know about it. Okay, and spread the word, and that's on the book, the registration. Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity, and I'll stick around if people have other questions. So.
No, this one is because I've been out.
Actually, I have multiple people coming to my student I'm coming because and I feel
So they said, why don't you develop it? I'm like, okay, cool. Somebody who knows about that. I'm going to instruct